July 1840, the British occupation of Afghanistan. British officer Arthur Connolly wrote to his colleague Henry Rawlinson at Kandahar of his hopes for British imperialism in Central Asia. He referred to Rawlinson's part in a quote, grand, noble, and great game in the region. The game would secure British interests and balance local powers, while helping, quote, Russia cordially to all that she has a right to expect. But the idea of the Great Game would not be remembered for being cordial or noble. At the same time, the perspective of the local rulers to the imperial rivalry is often arrogantly ignored, as if they were passive bystanders. Although Afghanistan, Iran, and the Central Asian Khanates were unable to match the Europeans' economic and military might, they were still active participants who played in the Great Game. They defiantly resisted the two superpowers of their day. Cunning rulers like the Afghan Dost Mohamed Khan worked to play the British and the Russians against each other to gain leverage. And the martial spirit of local peoples like the Turkmen Tepe tribe was frequently showcased in displays of furious resistance. This is their story. What we call the Great Game refers to the contest between Britain and Russia for hegemony in a large expanse of the Muslim world, namely Iran, Central Asia, and Afghanistan. After the Napoleonic Wars, Russia became a preeminent European power. It was already expanding in Central Asia and wanted to prevent British influence in the area. Britain was concerned that Russian expansion would threaten its lucrative empire in India. Both European empires maneuvered for advantage while trying to avoid a direct war. The game played out partly with armies, but also with agents, scholars, spies, and diplomats trying to gain advantage with local rulers. From the early 1800s to the 1907 Anglo-Russian Convention, both powers competed and established hegemony over Iran, Central Asia's various kingdoms, and Afghanistan through direct conquest, establishment of protectorates, or economic domination. With the 1907 Convention, they formally settled their spheres of influence and focused on allying against Germany, the new emergent power of Europe. The conventional and romanticized image of the Great Game involves modernized Europeans exploring and entering the supposedly ancient or medieval world of the Silk Roads and using it as a chessboard. But this vast area had been going through great political and economic change since the 18th century. Its rulers had their own interests and responses to colonial encroachment. Though usually at a disadvantage, the Muslim states of the region were also players in the Great Game, maneuvering through colonial competition and shaping the region to their own ends. Afghanistan was perhaps the central arena of the Great Game. Any Russian invasion of India would have to pass through it, making it especially sensitive for Britain. As we saw, the very term Great Game came into being during the British occupation of Afghanistan from 1839 to 1842. Amir Abdurrahman Khan, backed by the British to take the throne during their invasion of 1878 to 1880, himself published the idea of his country as a curtain between Britain and Russia. By the time the Afghans got embroiled in the Great Game, Ahmad Shah Durrani's once powerful empire had splintered under the weight of internal intrigues. Dost Mohamed Khan, Amir of Kabul, subsequently became the principal Afghan power. Though his territory and resources were small, Dost was ambitious and energetic. He aimed to conquer the other emirats left over from the Durrani Empire's collapse. When the Russians made overtures to him, Dost tried to leverage the competing interests of Russia and Britain. He used the threat of Russian interference to demand the takeover of territories which were once ruled by the Afghans, but now ruled by Britain's ally, the Sikh ruler Ranjit Singh. This was a dangerous gamble, as Britain decided to invade even when Dost abandoned any intentions of cooperating with Russia. They aimed to install their own client, Shah Shuja, Ahmad Shah Durrani's grandson. Ranjit Singh had also made expedient use of British interests to advance his own policies. A puppet regime on the Kabul throne would help secure his regional position. Shah Shuja had earlier been his hostage and had signed humiliating treaties to formally sign away Afghan territories to the Sikhs and act as their subordinate. Not to mention, Shuja was forced to hand over the legendary Kohinoor to the Sikh ruler. But once the British occupation failed, it was Dost who came out in a good position, now as a British ally. He used colonial interests in the region to expand his emirat, now with the help of British funds and arms. British opposition to Iran's conquest of Herat also allowed him to take that territory. These conquests created the basis for the modern Afghan state. All these plays by regional powers were much more relevant on the ground than the actions of Russia, whose bases in Central Asia were still very far away from Afghanistan. Russian overtures to Dost mostly formed an excuse for British invasion. By the second British invasion of Afghanistan in 1878, it was the height of the Great Game. The Sikhs were no longer a power, and both British India as well as the Russian Empire bordered Afghanistan directly. When Russia sent an unasked-for embassy to Kabul, the Emir Sher Ali Khan was caught in a precarious position. He did not entertain the Russian overtures, but refused British demands to send their own embassy. Attempts to keep neutral did not save Sher Ali, as the British used the blocking of their embassy as a pretext to invade again. The Russians refused to help. After a period of occupation and after suffering some reversals, the British backed Abdurrahman Khan to take the throne in 1881. He was barred from having any independent foreign policy, but like Dost, was backed with annual grants of cash and weapons. Britain and Russia set about formally defining the borders of his kingdom in order to manage their rivalries, and Afghanistan's economy was made dependent on foreign support. But the new Emir would also use this process to his own gain. Abdul Rahman was partly a product of the European-dominated world order. He had spent 10 years in Russian-ruled Samarkand. He believed in a powerful centralized state. The new borders and the inflow of British supplies allowed him to crush dissent and to brutally overpower territory never seriously ruled from Kabul before, like Kafiristan in the northeast or Hazarajat in central Afghanistan. The ethnic and religious violence unleashed by Abdurrahman, as he played the great game to his advantage, has left lasting wounds in modern Afghanistan. Where possible, Abdurrahman and his successor Habibullah also worked around British control of their foreign relations, forging ties with the wider Muslim world, especially British India and the Ottoman Empire. After the Great Game, in a newly independent Afghanistan, ties like these helped King Amanullah make bold advances in statecraft, notably in creating a sophisticated Islamic constitution for the modern state. Though Britain feared Russian attack through Afghanistan, in reality Russian influence there was limited. On the other hand, Central Asia was an area where Russia clearly dominated and Britain had a marginal role. Britain had sent agents including Arthur Connolly and Charles Stoddart to the kingdoms of Khokhand and Bukhara in 1841 to counter Russian expansion, but the Emir of Bukhara had both executed. At the turn of the 19th century, Central Asia's emirats and khanates were experiencing great changes. Old systems were coming to an end, as in Bukhara, where the last ruler claiming descent from Genghis Khan was deposed in 1785. Two great empires were also encroaching, the Manchu Qing Empire and Russia. As in the Great Game, local powers like the Kazakh hordes played both sides as they competed for influence. Embassies, armies, and spies traversed the vast territories, and Russia and the Qing negotiated to settle their borders and avoid war. But over the course of the 19th century, dominance clearly went to Russia. despite some hiccups like the failed invasion of the Khiva Khanate in 1839. Iran and Afghanistan suffered economic subjugation and indirect rule due to the Great Game. Central Asia, however, resembled British India more than these arenas because it was conquered territory. Russian conquest was the nail in the coffin for the long-standing political power of nomads. Nomadic power had been gradually extinguished since the 18th century, again by Russia and the Qing, not Russia and Britain. In the space of less than a decade, almost all of Central Asia's prominent states fell to the Russian military machine, as the Tsar's soldiers victoriously entered legendary Silk Road cities like Samarkand, Khiva, and Bukhara. The expansion of Russia also put an end to a time of bold state building, particularly in the case of Kokand, conquered in 1876. From a small state based in the Fergana Valley, Kokand became a rapidly expanding power, with a formidable gunpowder army, a growing core population, and significant improvements to the agricultural economy. It remained a dynamic state up to the time of its conquest, which it worked hard to resist despite Russian technological superiority. Bukhara, absorbed as a protectorate of Russia, used the opportunity of colonial border making to solidify internal control, as in Afghanistan. We will see that the same was attempted in Iran. But unlike those countries, which would ultimately attain independent statehood, Bukhara would be dissolved as an entity in 1920 during the Russian Civil War. None of the pre-colonial states of the region survive today. For a brief time in the 1730s and 40s, Iran was a major power under the Emperor Nader Shah. Nader even came to an agreement which saw Russia withdraw from Iranian lands it tried to capture. But his aggressive centralization and militarism led to his assassination in 1747 and a subsequent civil war. After half a century of political fragmentation, the Qajar dynasty emerged and reunified Iran in the 1790s. Almost immediately afterwards, it would find itself at the prey of Russian imperial ambition, as Russia sought to expand its influence in the Caucasus, which Iran regarded as its territory. The two countries went to war in 1804, and Iran lost badly. Even Napoleon's conquest of Moscow in 1812 did not stop Russia from defeating the Qajars and imposing the Treaty of Gulistan, which annexed a chunk of the Caucasus and imposed an unequal trade relationship on Iran. In 1828, Iran lost another war to Russia, lost more of the Caucasus, and suffered further economic restrictions in the Treaty of Turkmen Tepe. The British had had contacts with the Qajars since the beginning of the 19th century, particularly due to fears of French and Afghan attacks on India. With the Qajar defeats against Russia, they were now concerned that Iran would become a Russian protectorate, threatening routes to India. Fath Ali Shah Qajar tried to use the rivalry between the powers to obtain British help, but this remained limited to military training and specialists. In Afghanistan, the British had the position and incentive to maintain its own client state, while in Central Asia, Russia was able to outright conquer most of the region. Iran was the country which found itself well and truly split between the domination of both colonial powers. Though they gave some support against Russia, at the same time the British wanted to limit Qajar power, especially over the routes to India via Afghanistan. A key sticking point was Herat, a major city in Afghanistan. The Qajars showed their ambition and capacity to expand their regional power by besieging the city in 1837 and taking it in 1856. But Britain foiled them on both occasions. Russia backed Iran in 1837, while Britain threatened military action and caused the Qajars to withdraw. In 1856, Britain did in fact go to war and reversed the Qajar's successful conquest. They then assisted Dost Mohamed in capturing Herat in 1863. As a response to loss of territory over the course of the century, the Qajar state embarked on surveys and campaigns within their borders, like their Afghan and Bukharan contemporaries. Border regions like Baluchistan, Khorasan, and Khuzestan, as well as the lands inhabited by powerful tribal federations like the Bakhtiaris, were seen as frontiers in need of pacification and regular state control. The Iranian state adopted the newly imposed European system of fixed borders and a unitary state, but their efforts met with partial success at best, as the state lacked the power to enforce its will, and locals often refused to cooperate with officials, many of whom were seen to be corrupt. Economically, Iran was severely exploited as well. Russia's unequal treaties subordinated Iran's economy, while the discovery of oil in the early 20th century led to a British monopoly over Iranian oil. The state worked to modernize production and grow the economy in response to Iran's place in the new global order, but colonial domination kept the country at a disadvantage. The monarchy was seen as impotent, but it too was held up by colonial interests. In 1906, reformists, merchants, and clerics forced the Qajars to establish a parliament and constitution in what is called the Constitutional Revolution. But British and especially Russian military support allowed the dynasty to abolish these reforms in 1908 and 1911. The 1907 Anglo-Russian Convention split the country into zones of influence for each empire. This history of foreign interference is bitterly remembered in Iran until today. All the areas covered here were subject to domination by the colonial powers of Britain and Russia. The great game in which they found themselves was not a fair one, and as these powerful empires vied for influence, they subjugated the economies and politics of the region with immense and long-lasting consequences. The Qing Empire was also a significant player in the Central Asia arena. Successfully and unsuccessfully, the dynamic Muslim powers of Iran, Central Asia, and Afghanistan faced the challenges of the Great Game and played themselves. They tried to balance or take advantage of colonial competition and embarked on their own programs of conquest, state building, and reform. Sometimes, these policies also left cruel legacies. But there was far more happening in these lands of the Muslim world than the game between Russia and Britain. That is to say nothing of the cultural, intellectual, and material responses of the people, rather than states or rulers, to the Great Game and colonialism. That rich topic deserves its own discussion. Thank you guys for watching. I want to thank my Patreon for always supporting. If you want to financially support Hikmah History, there's a link to my Patreon in the description to this video. Until next time, peace!